eagerly excited about the prospect of hearing Hegel's logic in 2 days, so I'm very grateful to be here. Hegel's account of reflection in the science of logic is one of the most difficult and dense parts of his philosophy. The aim of this paper is to try to shed some light on this account. In particular, I hope to clarify Hegel's understanding of the complex relation between reflection and immediacy. Robert Pippin reads Hegel's discussion of reflection as an account of thought's reflective activity. 30 years ago, however, Walter Jeschke pointed out that Hegel in the logic is discussing neither the reflective activity of consciousness nor that of the understanding, but rather reflection as such. The logic, according to Jeschke, is an ontology of the concept, not a study of various forms of subjective thought. Reflection as such, as it is thematized in the logic, must thus be an ontological structure, not just an operation of the mind. This understanding of reflection is, in my judgment, correct. Reflection is what being itself proves to be at a certain point in its logical development. My purpose here, however, is not to dwell on the ontological or epistemic status of reflection. It is to examine the logical structure of reflection in order to understand how reflection develops logically. Reflection is defined by Hegel at one point as the movement from nothing to nothing. There is, however, something misleading about this definition. For strictly speaking, reflection is not the movement from one negative to another. It is the movement of a negative that is utterly self-negating. Reflection, in other words, is the movement of sheer negativity. Essence proves to be negativity because it is the sphere of non-immediacy. Being, for Hegel, is the sphere of immediacy. Essence, by contrast, is the sphere of non-immediacy. Since there is no simple immediacy in the sphere of essence, however, essence cannot be simply and immediately non-immediacy. It is rather non-being, or the negative, that is so lacking in immediacy that it is utterly self-negating and self-sublating. For this reason, essence takes the form of sheer negativity or reflection. This is, without doubt, a strange and unusual conception of essence. It appears to be very far removed from our more familiar ways of conceiving essence as ground or substrate. If Hegel is right, however, it is the conception of essence that we are forced to adopt if we take seriously the idea that the essence of things is not immediacy. Let's look more closely now at Hegel's conception of reflection. Hegel notes that in negating itself, the reflexive negative does not become something other than the negative it is. It doesn't cease being negative. On the contrary, it reinforces itself and becomes doubly negative. In so doing, Hegel writes, the negative relates to and coincides with itself. In coinciding with itself, however, the self-relating, reflexive negative comes to exhibit the very quality it's supposed to lack. For it comes to exhibit simple equality with itself, or immediacy. The negative that coincides with itself is immediately itself, and not something else. The paradox here is that the negative comes to exhibit immediacy precisely because it lacks immediacy. The reflexive negative is not simply and immediately negative, because in the sphere of essence there is no simple immediacy. The reflexive negative is therefore self-negative. It is the negative that is not just the negative that it is. Yet precisely because it is self-negating, it relates to itself, coincides with itself, and thereby acquires the immediacy that consists in being equal with itself. This paradox, however, is not quite as sharp as it seems, since we are talking here of immediacy in two subtly different senses. The reflexive negative lacks any simple immediacy, but it acquires what Dieter calls reflective immediacy. Such reflective immediacy is still immediacy. It consists in being what one is, being oneself. And in that sense, is not something utterly distinct from simple immediacy. But it is immediacy that is posited by the movement of reflection, rather than simply there. This immediacy evidently has a place in the sphere of essence, whereas all other simple immediacy is mere illusion. Hegel emphasizes that the reflexive negative acquires immediacy not by becoming something else, but by coinciding with itself in negating itself. The reflexive negative acquires immediacy, therefore, by doubling back or turning back on itself. The idea of the turn back, Rückkehr, plays an important role in Hegel's account. Hegel introduces the idea with these words: Die Beziehung des Negativen auf sich selbst ist also seine Rückkehr in sich. In Miller's English translation, this reads, the self-relation of the negative is therefore its return into itself. Yet the word return in the English version is subtly misleading, for it leads us to think that the negative becomes once again what it once was. Hegel's point, however, is that by turning back or recoiling on itself, the negative comes to exhibit an immediacy that it never previously enjoyed. It comes to acquire immediacy in the very movement of turning back on itself. In turning back on itself, the negative turns into itself, into the immediacy of being itself for the first time. The immediacy exhibited by the negative thus arises in and through the movement of turning back. Indeed, it is generated by and so results from that movement. Hegel expresses the thought that immediacy is the result of the movement of negation in the following way. Immediacy, he writes, is the sublating of the negative, and thus consists in the return from a negative. Sie ist Unmittelbarkeit als das Aufheben des Negativen, aber Unmittelbarkeit schlechthin nur als diese Beziehung oder als Rückkehr aus einem. In negating itself, therefore, the reflexive negative transforms itself into immediacy or equality with self. The immediacy that arises in this way is not pure and simple immediacy, but immediacy as result. The name that Hegel gives to this immediacy is positiveness, Gesetztsein. Positive immediacy is not purely and simply immediate, precisely because it's posited by the self-negating of the negative. There's also a second immediacy associated with reflection. This is the immediacy of the very movement of reflection itself, the immediacy of the movement of positing, Setzen. This movement exhibits immediacy because it does not relate to or become anything other than itself. The self-negating negative negates itself and remains itself in so doing. Reflection, as Hegel puts it, is, I quote, positing insofar as it is immediacy as a returning movement, end of quote. Now, there is much, much more that needs to be said in order to make clear exactly what is involved in the positing of positiveness. Enough has been said, however, to note that with the concept of reflection, the concept of essence undergoes an important transformation. At the start of Hegel's account of essence, the concept of essence serves to reduce immediacy to mere illusion, or Schein. If the truth or essence of being is non-immediacy, then the immediacy of being with which we began can be no more than seeming immediacy. With the emergence of the idea of reflection, however, essence becomes productive rather than destructive of immediacy. It is now understood to posit immediacy, to bring it into being, in a movement that Klaus Schmidt names creatio ex nihilo. Subsequent conceptions of essence as the ground or the cause of being will be indebted to, indeed be versions of, the idea of reflection as the positing of positiveness. The problem, however, is that the immediacy that is posited is not immediacy in an undiluted sense. It is immediacy that negates or sublates itself due to the fact that it is the result of, and so is mediated by, the movement of positing. Positive immediacy always refers back to the reflexivity that gave rise to it. It bears the clear mark of its indebtedness for all to see, and in that sense isn't properly immediate. Not only is the immediacy of positive being a mediated and therefore sublated immediacy, but so also is the immediacy of positing itself. This is because such positing is not pure unmediated positing, but also the presupposing of an immediacy from which all positing begins, or at least appears to begin. Dieter Heinrich maintains that presupposing is the positing of something as independent of all positing, and as that upon which positing itself depends. This is Heinrich now. Das Setzen von etwas, das gesetzt ist, als unabhängig von dem, aufgrund dessen es gesetzt ist. The problem with this interpretation, however, at least from my point of view, is that what is presupposed acquires independence in Hegel's account only for external reflection. Presupposing as a moment of absolute reflection is not the positing of what is independent of reflection. It is rather the presupposing of what is simply and immediately negative. This is suggested in particular by the following lines, and I quote Hegel now. Immediacy emerges only as return, and is that negative, which is the illusion of the beginning that is negated by the return. Die Unmittelbarkeit kommt überhaupt nur als Rückkehr hervor und ist dasjenige Negative, welches der Schein des Anfangs ist, der durch die Rückkehr negiert wird. Let's look a little more closely at what Hegel is saying here. In these lines, Hegel first reminds us that immediacy arises only in the movement of return. That is, in the movement wherein the reflexive negative negates itself. He then goes on, however, to attribute that immediacy to the negative that is the illusion of the beginning that is negated by the return. So on the one hand, immediacy is said to be the result of the movement of return, but on the other hand, it's also said to constitute that from which the movement of return seems to begin. What is that from which the movement of return seems to begin? What is the apparent starting point that is then negated in the movement of return? Surely it must be the negative itself. What appears to happen in the movement of return is that an initial simple negative is negated,